This is a flag box I made for my son to remember his grandfather. My dad served in the SeaBees in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. The finish turned out really nice on this. Stick around and I'll show you how I did this. Stick around to the end and I'll show you the mistakes so you don't make them too. To start this thing off, I grabbed a piece of cherry from my stack and ran it through the jointer just to get one edge straight. And then I put it face down on the jointer and got one of the faces perfectly flat. I took that face and put it down on the planer. That way I knew everything was exactly parallel and they were the exact same thickness. I took measurements from my retirement flag. Any footage you see in here, the flag is actually my retirement flag. My flag measures 22 inches on the bottom and 16 inches on the sides. Don't use those dimensions for your wood. You're going to need a lot more because of the angles. To get the perfect length, I actually put the box into SketchUp to determine the exact lengths on the wood. Bottom came out to be right around 26.5 and the sides 18 3/4. So I worked with that. And you won't get the final length on the sides until you go ahead and put it together and sneak up on this 45-degree cut at the top. I set up a stop block for the two sides. That way I knew they were going to be the exact same length. I cut them a little bit long so I can get the exact length at the end. Now each piece is going to require a dado for the plexiglass and then a rabbet in the back for the backing plate. The plexiglass is right around 1/4 inch, so I decided to set the depth 1/4 inch as well. So I set my table saw up to 1/4 inch using my measurement blocks. I then set the blade to cut 1/4 inch in on each board. I was too lazy to put my dado stack in. I'm going to do the dado with just one blade. Plexiglass measured just under 1/4 inch, so I'll need to be real careful and not cut the dado too big. It's real important to set up the table saw and not touch it until you're done with the first series of cuts. I actually cut these 3 pieces and I cut a piece of scrap wood. That is going to help me fit the plexiglass a lot easier on a piece of scrap instead of using the project wood. So once all 4 cuts are made, 3 of the project wood and 1 scrap, I just tap the fence over slightly and make a second cut on the scrap. That way I can test fit the plexiglass. And be careful here, you don't want to go too far. So sneak up on the width of that dado. For the rabbet, I decided to use my router table and a rabbeting bit. So I played around with the depth of the bit on a piece of scrap to make sure it was exactly flush with the plywood I was going to use for the back. And then I used a fence to set the width. So I used a piece of scrap until I got the width and the depth exactly what I wanted. After that, I went ahead and cut the rabbet into the project board. Time to cut the angles on the boards, and this is the most difficult part, especially with the 22.5-degree cuts. I've done them before on a table saw, but I'd rather use the miter saw. I have a finishing blade over there, so I went ahead and built a jig. It's very simple, it's just a square. I used that jig and set the miter saw to 22.5 degrees, clamped it down to the jig. This is the safest way I've found to do it, and I'm glad I built a jig. I'm sure I'll be making another flag box here soon. So the long piece gets 22.5-degree cuts on both ends. The side pieces only get 22.5 on one end and 45 on the other. So you have to be very careful. Make sure when you make that 22.5-degree cut that it's going to line up the dado and the rabbets on both sides. You can't screw that up. So I went ahead and made the 22.5-degree cuts on both ends of the bottom one and one end of each of the sides. I left these at 90 degrees up here, and remember, they're still a little bit long. Once I have these cut, I take them and line them up and verify about where that 45 degrees goes. So what I did was I set up a stop block, cut them at 45, but I cut them long. And then I cut a little bit off each time, and I did it both at the same time. So I'd bring it back to the bottom one and verify, and it did end up being about 18 3/4 for the perfect fit on the miters. You want to sneak up on that cut. So once all those cuts were made, I set the sides onto a piece of plywood and drew a line where the rabbet was. That way I knew exactly the dimensions that this plexiglass and the plywood were going to be, since I set the depth of both of them to about 1/4 inch. So once I had that line, all I had to do was cut that plywood, and I chose to use my track saw. You can use a bandsaw, a jigsaw, circular saw, whatever you want. Once I had the plywood cut, now I've got a template for my plexiglass. It's the exact same size. So I drew a line on the plexiglass and again used my track saw to make that cut. And you can see how the plywood goes into the rabbet. And this is how the plexiglass goes into the dados. So the engraving I did with my CNC, and the way you do that is you reverse the image in the software and then you do it on the back. I think it turned out pretty well. My first time engraving on plexiglass. Believe me, I used it on a lot of scrap pieces of plexiglass until I got it just right. So then it was time for sanding. I did a lot of sanding on this. I went up to 180 grit, and then I took some water and a paper towel and popped the grain. Once you put water on the wood, the grain swells up. This allows you to sand it down again. After the water dries, I sanded to 220. Before I put it together, I decided at the last minute to put a bevel on the edges. And I did it on the outside edge and on the inside edge. I did the outside edge first, and then on the inside, I lowered the bit just slightly so it's a smaller bevel, but it's still noticeable. You can see the bevel. I then took 220 grit and hand sanded the bevels down. And then I used mineral spirits to clean everything up before finish. So now it's time for glue up. The way I decided to do that was lay all the boards out on a table, put them edge to edge, and use painter's tape to hold them together. Then flipped it over, and that gave me access to where the glue joints are. Make sure you don't put too much glue in the joints because it's really hard to get to, especially on the inside corners. Now the way you do that is you fold it up, but there's a complication. You got to put the plexiglass in. So you got to fold the thing over onto the plexiglass, and then you can make sure it's all taped together. Holds it long enough for me to get my pin nailer out, and I drove some pin in each of the joints. The bottom ones I weren't worried about, but the top ones I put some pin nails in here that I'll patch up a little later. I decided to finish with shellac. I have de-wax flakes that I mix with denatured alcohol, and I make it into a 2-pound cut, and I applied it with a sponge brush. After it dried, I used a finishing pad. It's the equivalent of using steel wool. You can use steel wool, but I used that finishing pad to make it nice and smooth. After the first coat, I used a small rag, balled it up, and put it inside of another rag. And then I use that to apply shellac very thinly. Put a tiny bit more denatured alcohol into my mix. That way the coats go on very thin. And every coat you put on, you could just see the depth of the wood come out. I just love the shellac finish. And of course, at the last minute, I decided to make a pedestal and the base. The pedestal, I just took a piece of maple and started cutting it until I liked the shape. And then I put some bevels on the edges. And then I took my laser and cut the SeaBee motto into it. The base, I just grabbed a piece of stock, milled it down, and put a bevel on it on all 4 sides. I attached it from the bottom by countersinking trim screws. Then on the inside, I went ahead and screwed the flag box onto the pedestal. I think it's going to make a great gift for my son. I'm going to take it over there tomorrow. So thanks for sticking around. If this has helped you in any way, please like and subscribe.